Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the Director of the McKee Institute of Public Policy and Governance. Thanks so much for joining us for our discussion on water policy today. Before I get to today's events, I have just a couple of little announcements to make. The McKee Institute will be hosting 3 events over the next month on the subject of emergency management in light of the centenary of the Halifax explosion, which some emergency management scholars cite as the beginning of the modern emergency management studies. So I'm delighted to announce today that Sherry Fink will be coming to Halifax on November 27th. The McKee Institute is co-hosting her visit with Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. The event will start at 7 p.m. in the Scotia Theatre at St. Mary's campus. Sherry Fink is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, 5 Days at Memorial, Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital. The book is about difficult ethical choices made in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. She's a correspondent at the New York Times, where her and her colleagues' stories on the West Africa Ebola crisis were recognized with a 2015 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. Her story, The Deadly Choices at Memorial, received a 2010 Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting and a National Magazine Award for Reporting. Dr. Fink will be discussing ethics and emergency management during her visit to Halifax. In case some students have forgotten, we will not be meeting next week because it's reading week. The following week, Tuesday, November 14th, will be our first event on emergency management. We'll be discussing the new book that I've co-authored with Ben Bissett and Brian Mills, Too Critical to Fail, which examines how governments manage threats to critical infrastructure, interpreted through the lens of disasters and crises such as natural disasters, industrial failures, pandemics, terrorist attacks, and cyber threats. The book concerns itself with the efficiency, the fairness, accountability, and stability of the regimes that oversee and manage risk in specific sectors. It also takes into account the contextual pressures from the market, the media, and interest groups that influence government responses. We'll be joined by Professor Ron Pillow. Ron is from the Department of Industrial Engineering and the Associate Scientific Director of the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network, otherwise known as MEOPAR. We'll also be joined by Dr. Dan Henster from the University of Waterloo, who's the author of Multi-Level Governance and Emergency Management in Canadian Municipalities. The third event has not yet been confirmed, but we hope to have something to say about our third event of emergency management quite soon. So on today's business, I'm going to take a minute to discuss the genesis of this panel. About 3 years ago, the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association asked me to help them understand their risks better. So with the help of the Centre for Security Science, Defence Research Development Canada, and Public Safety Canada, we set to work on developing a risk profile for the sector. So I asked Dr. Calvin Burns to work with me on the project, as well as Gwen Moncrief Gould, who was actually in this policy class 2 years ago and is now living in Ottawa and perhaps is listening to us online, I'm not sure. And Warren McDougall, also from the McKee Institute, has worked with us on this project. What became obvious very early on in the project, while we can study perceived risk at the firm level, water supply is situated in a context underpinned by various technical, market, environmental, cultural, social, psychological, legal, and political challenges that accompany the effort to provide drinking water to people in this country and around the world. In order to understand better the policy challenges associated with water, we need to take a tight lens to examine the individual water service providers. We also need to take a broader look at trends and contextual pressures in the sector as a whole. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to say that we invited a group of distinguished thinkers on the subject of water supply to help us to animate this policy discussion today. We'll start with Dr. Calvin Burns, who will summarize our initial findings of risk perception among CWWA members, which is the Canadian Water Wastewater Association, CWWA members, and then we'll expand the discussion to examine water supply on First Nations, and then go beyond our borders to examine water issues in different parts of the world. This comparative perspective will hopefully shed new light on how we treat water at home, and a perspective on our responsibility to help provide the essentials of life to others on the planet, and the complexity at times of doing just that. So as is the custom, I'll introduce the speakers just before they speak, and I will start with Dr. Calvin Burns. So Calvin Burns, Calvin and I have collaborated together for a number of years on a number of different risk issues. So this was an energized partnership, I would say, to start with when we started this project. Calvin Burns is an industrial psychologist at the University of Strathclyde, UK. Dr. Burns' research centers on how risk perception and trust attitudes influence risk decision-making and risk-taking behaviors in predominantly high-hazard organizations. He's also co-authored a new study on Canadian water infrastructure, released this October, which a part of which was disseminated to the class. One of the outputs that we generated from that study. The full report will be available in mid-December, I think, when the final report will be ready. So I'll pass it over to you, Calvin, who will summarize our results from our study before we open up discussion to others. Calvin.
Thanks. Thank you, Kevin. Good morning. As Kevin mentioned, I'm going to speak about some of the work that Kevin and I did. So I'm going to tell you about attitudes and perceptions about risk resilience and security in water utilities. Risk is traditionally understood from an engineering or management science point of view as likelihood times severity. Usually people from the rational actor approach talk about real risk. They're looking at the number of adverse events that have occurred, at the number of accidents, the number of injuries. Sometimes they use theoretical models like quantitative risk assessments or human reliability analyses to estimate risk. Well, as a psychologist, I look at perceived risk because risk can mean different things to different people. And what risk perception is it's the study of beliefs, attitudes, judgments, feelings towards hazards and the risks associated with them. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Why is perceived risk important? Well, risk perception is a basis for risk acceptance. As a psychologist, I'm interested in being able to predict and explain human behavior in a number of different contexts. So looking at how water utility personnel perceive risk is going to give me an indication of their future risk-taking or risk-mitigating behaviors. So what we did was we conducted a questionnaire survey, as psychologists do, to measure attitudes and perceptions about risk and security. So the method was we used an online questionnaire with our partners at the CWWA. They distributed the link to their members. We received responses from more than 140 water utilities from all 10 Canadian provinces. We had 352 individual responses. 73% were male, which is probably reflective of the demographics of the water sector. I wouldn't necessarily say we had a representative sample of all utilities across Canada, but we had a good representative sample of small, medium, and large utilities across Canada. 45% of our sample were senior managers, and of the remaining 55%, most were managers, operational field staff, or technical support staff. So how did we measure risk perception? The CWWA and Public Safety Canada gave us details about hazards, threats, defenses that were important to security and risk resilience. Some examples of those hazards were unauthorized access to premises, hacking, flooding, insider threats, loss of power, severe storms, contamination of the water supply. We also asked about defenses and systems, so fences and external barriers, intrusion detection software, SCADA systems, employee ID cards. And this is normally what happens when you do a risk perception study. Usually we find two main factors of risk perception. The first factor is dread, or how afraid somebody is of the hazard, and the second factor is the unknown factor. How much do we know or don't know about the hazard or its long-term effects? We didn't take this approach because I didn't really think it was going to tell us anything. I mean, if we asked about cybersecurity, things like hacking, well, people would probably say, yeah, we're somewhat afraid of it, and well, we maybe don't know a lot about it, so we might see attitudes and perceptions about hacking coming into this bottom right-hand quadrant. But if we ask something about aging infrastructure, people would probably say, well, I'm not really afraid of it. and we know a lot about it. We might find it down here. So we looked at, we tried to take a more traditional approach, looking at the likelihood times severity aspect. And so we tried to measure people's likelihood ratings and their severity ratings. As my colleagues will attest, from what we were talking about last night at dinner, how you ask a question will very much determine the response that you get. So some of the things are, we asked people, for each of the following hazards and threats, think about the defenses and systems that your water utility has in place. Then rate how likely security at your water utility is to be adversely affected by these hazards or threats. And we gave them things like flooding, severe storms. And we also asked them about their defenses and systems. How likely are the defenses and systems to be breached at your water utility? And we asked people to rate these on a 5-point scale, looking from highly unlikely to highly likely. We then did severity ratings, following a very similar thing. How severe could a security breach or incident be to your water utility from the following hazards or threats? And how severe could a security breach in the following defenses and systems be to your water utility? And again, people made responses on a 5-point scale from negligible to extremely severe. So we are looking to produce something like this. And this is a standard risk profile or risk matrix whereby things in green are things that you really wouldn't worry about. Things in the yellow would represent active risk management. Things in red are intolerable where drastic action is needed. So when I plotted the data, this is basically what we had. Risk is usually expressed as a probability ranging between 0 and 1. We can see here, I think there's about 18 or so different hazards and threats and systems on here. We can see, the risk of earthquake seems to be quite low in terms of likelihood. The impact, somewhat middling. We see the highest risk is coming out from aging infrastructure and severe storms. But this is a bit of a mess. So what I did, it's hard to kind of interpret what goes with what. So I did something called a factor analysis. And what that is, it's a statistical technique that reduces all of these data points into a smaller set of groups. What risks go with what? So when I did that, I found 5 main factors of risk perception. So this is a little bit easier to interpret. So the 5 main factors we found were infrastructure-related risks, things like aging infrastructure, storms, risks to the water supply, things, source water contamination, drought, risks of physical access, cyber-related risks, and then we had another factor that I wasn't quite sure how to interpret. I called them other uncertain risks. This contained, I can't remember off the top of my head what it contained. I think things like that's it. Extreme weather and insider threats. So, and so you can see how they were plotted on the likelihood times severity grid. But I also calculated the risk scores. Took the likelihood score and multiplied it by the severity score. And basically, what you can see is, these scores could range from 0 to 1. Infrastructure related was the highest risk, but it still didn't come out. People weren't overly concerned with it. We had a risk score of 0.38. So how do these risks stack up? Well, infrastructure related risks were statistically higher than the other 4 risks. Risk score for water supply was higher than physical access, cyber, and other uncertain risks. And we didn't find any difference between uncertain risks and physical access. and other uncertain risks was lower than all of the others. I was expecting to find differences between senior managers and the rest of the workforce. This is consistent with what we see in the wider occupational risk literature. We didn't find any differences, and this, I wouldn't say it's good news or bad news, but it suggests that everyone within the water sector seemed to share the same mental model of risk. Senior managers understood risk as in the same way that members of the frontline workforce did. And we also compared water utilities by size of population, and basically what we found was that the bigger the water utility, the more they were concerned with physical access, cyber-related, and other uncertain risks. So what are the implications of our findings? Well, our findings, these risk perceptions are valid in the sense that they will influence employees' risk acceptance and their security-related behaviors. But if there is a disparity between their perceptions and the actual number of security incidents or theoretical estimates of adverse events, for example, cyber-related risks weren't perceived very highly, well, then this suggests that there's perhaps better risk communication is needed about these risks to the from perhaps regulators or Public Safety Canada to operators. It also suggests, in terms of REN's risk rationality, that we need to think about how we manage these risks differently. Complex risks like infrastructure-related risks, water supply, physical access, we know how to fix broken water mains. That's kind of easy to do. Engineers have a lot of experience with that. However, for things like uncertain risks, we don't have a lot of reliable data or a lot of experience dealing with these. So the implications for how we learn about how to deal with these risks are going to be very different. So that's kind of the big message I want to kind of leave here, is that, yeah, we did find five different factors or five different types of perceived risk with respect to water, and we can think about them in terms of them being a complex risk or an uncertain risk, and I'll leave it there.
Melita Bhardwaj is a toxicologist at the University of Saskatchewan with expertise in human and environmental health risk assessment. She is committed to finding solutions for and understanding issues associated with inequitable access, supply, and provision of safe, sustainable drinking water supplies for First Nations, rural, and remote Saskatchewan communities. Melita, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I have my watch here. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Mick McKee, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'd also like to thank Kevin for the invitation, my colleagues, and I would like to thank you for attending. I look forward to your questions. So when we think about water security and water, it means different things for different people. And I think to understand how we manage risk or perceive risk of water and water security and manage it, we need to understand the different perspectives people have on the meaning of water and water security. For some, like our Indigenous people, water is life, water is spirit, water is very sacred. It is the blood vein of our Mother Earth. For some, water is a commodity. It is something that we buy and sell. And it is also recognized for its functionality. And perhaps when thinking about water as a commodity, it may have lost its human, social, and cultural dimensions. So when we think about risk perception of water and water security and the management of it, we have to consider the perspectives of different people. Now, you don't have to go too far to into the media and into the newspapers to see the issues around access to safe drinking water in First Nations communities. I'd like to express that First Nations are 90 times more likely to have no access to safe drinking water, that 30% of water systems in First Nations communities are considered high risk, and as of September 2017, there are 101 boil water advisories that have been long-term in First Nations communities. Long-term boil water advisories are those that are greater than 1 year in duration. And when we consider public health implications of a boil water advisory, it is advised when you have a boil water advisory not to bathe your children because of the potential to be exposed to a hazard in the water as a result of bathing the child. So just think about that. Now, governments in Canada have basically addressed issues for First Nations communities through the First Nations Water Management Strategy and have implemented 6 major strategies over a 10 or 12-year period from 2001 to 2013, with the culminating event of the passing of Bill S-8, which allows the government to create regulations for First Nations drinking water. So our partners asked us, you know, how is this progress, how has government been doing, and how has progress been made? So what we did was we looked at the progress reports related to these 6 major initiatives, and we found that within these reports there were 4 major indicators utilized to sort of gauge success. So what we found was that proportion of high-risk communities removed off that list was considered as an indicator of success. The dealing with priority communities that were identified, there were 21 priority communities identified that required immediate action in 2006. And these priority communities were classified as priority because they were under a long-term boil water advisory and their water system was categorized as high risk for human health. The next indicator looked at the proportion of operators that were certified and the number of communities with maintenance management plans. Now, these indicators were quantitative, and we tried to look at the data that reflected the success utilizing these indicators. And what we found over the term of this 12-year period was that there was some success. However, when you look at the number of high priority communities taken off that list, we found that a consultant report in 2011 by Negan Bernstein that conducted the assessment revised the government findings from the previous year. And in fact, we saw a decline of those high-risk systems or an increase in the high-risk system percentages or the proportion. We also noted that there was an increase in the number of trained operators, but this may demonstrate that there was an implementation of the circuit rider training program, but we found, working with water treatment plant operators in First Nations communities, that operators are really difficult to retain. For example, water treatment plant operators express that they hadn't had holidays for 7 years because there is no one to take their place, and that some municipalities, once the operator is trained, entice the First Nations water treatment operator to work with the municipality because they get paid more. Also, we noted that maintenance management template became available in 2010, and there was increased reports that these maintenance management plans were put in place in First Nations communities. However, we don't understand whether or not they are operational, implemented, and are followed within the community. So are these indicators really measuring success? So what other indicators do we need to indicate that there's going to be or could be success in First Nations communities? We also have to understand that water supply systems are very diverse in First Nations communities. We have water distributed systems, we have truck to cistern systems, and we also have wells. that access groundwater. So in order to understand the risks perceived by First Nations communities, we have to understand the water supply system itself, and we have to understand the risks within that water supply system to manage those risks. And you can see from this picture that we did a study that looked at the water treatment plant and a truck-to-cistern water supply system in 2 communities in Saskatchewan. And what we found was that there was contamination across the supply chain. And I'm just going to present some results here. So what we found was that there was significantly higher risk of coliforms in trucks during late summer. So there was a seasonal aspect to potential risk of coliforms. We also found that there was significantly higher risk overall of coliforms in cistern-served houses versus piped distributed houses. And we also found that there was significantly higher risk of coliforms in houses during late summer. So we found that there was a significant difference in terms of risk in a distributed system versus a cistern system and those that are in a truck-to-cistern water supply. Now, in 2016, in October actually, we held an Indigenous Water Forum. And we asked water treatment plant operators and community members from various communities across Saskatchewan to place issues and challenges in 3 categories: as important, very important, or very important and urgent. And what we found 18 major important issues in these communities. But I'm just going to highlight 4 main ones. And one of the things that we were hearing is that we need to really coordinate efforts for water protection. And this involves coordination among all people within Canada, nationally. That there is a movement to unite Indigenous people in Canada for better water management and to plan for uncertain risks. And in Saskatchewan last year, we had an oil spill. Thank you. So this was an uncertain risk that wasn't planned for in terms of water supply. Building relations among people engaged in water management and policy making, and also to increase communication and transparent communication. So we also talked to several water treatment plant operators, and what we did was we looked at the problems from the individual, at the reserve level, at the provincial, federal level, as well as through time. And what the water treatment plant operators were telling us is there's a lack of money and physical capacity at the level of the reserve. And this speaks to maintenance issues, water supply, water infrastructure issues, and long-term planning as a result. And this quote really depicts that. And also access to parts for maintenance. We also looked at solutions. What are some positive solutions moving forward? And when we look at forward-looking solutions, we talked about long-term planning. Let's not just make a water treatment plant for today, but let's plan for the future so that it meets capacity, so it can functionally operate and feed the community for generations. And again, this quote speaks to that long-term plan. They also indicated increased communication and building relations and improved relations with the stakeholders involved in management, First Nations, government, and the province. So across those levels, from the individual to the reserve, federal, and provincial. So there is an understanding of the diverse perspectives on the meaning of water and water security for different people within our country. So moving forward towards water security, acknowledge, respect diverse views, understand risk to inform risk management solution for decentralized water systems, and building relationships, partnerships, and improved communication for co-developed solutions for better management strategies for our First Nations communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Marc De Ville is a veteran journalist and the author of 15 and counting books, the most recent being Back to the Well, Rethinking the Future of Water, published in the fall of 2015. In 2016, he was shortlisted for the 2016 Donner Prize for Best Public Policy Book by a Canadian. He has won several awards for his work and is currently working on The History of Hell. I can't wait to read that one. Okay, Mark.
Well, I'm the only panelist here with absolutely no academic expertise or technical expertise, so I'm going to give you, as much as I can, a fast overview of the global water situation, and I have to be pretty sketchy because the world's a big place in 10 minutes. So let me start this. When I was writing my first book on water in 1998, I attended a conference in Paris organized by UNESCO, and during the first day, a Spanish hydrologist called Ramon Madurga really annoyed all of the delegates by asking this question. He said, "This conference is called Water, the Looming Crisis." Well, I've been attending conferences for 20 years, he said, and always they say, water, the looming crisis. And why isn't it looming? Why hasn't it loomed? Good question. The discussion went on from there. In 2003, I attended a second conference, this time in Costa Rica, and guess what it was called? Water, the Looming Crisis. It still hadn't loomed, right? Anyway, so one more example. In Edinburgh in 2012, the International Water Resources Association had a water conference. The title wasn't Water, the Looming Crisis, but one of the main themes of the conference was, guess what? Water, the looming crisis. So what's going on here? Is water a crisis or not? And I think Ramon Madurga was both right and wrong when he said, he asked that question. He was right in the sense that there is, in fact, no single global water crisis. Not like air pollution, where if somebody pollutes the air, it spreads across the globe, and you've got a global crisis. Water, on the other hand, is susceptible to literally thousands of small, local, regional water basin crises, all of which have to be solved locally, maybe financed from abroad, but all have to be solved locally. And this makes solution to water issues, in my view, easier rather than harder. But you have to remember that this water, conserving water in Boston, for example, which they've done extremely well, doesn't get a drop to Haiti. Ontario can conserve as much water as it like, is not going to help Yemen. Even good water management in Germany is not going to help anybody more than a time zone away, only the Germans. Mali's problems are not catastrophic for Haiti. Haiti is not catastrophic for Bolivia or for Lubbock, Texas. Indeed, there are many parts of the world where there are, in fact, no water crises. None of which is to say that the water world is in good shape. Plainly, it's not. What the World Bank calls the dismal arithmetic of water can be divided into two sorts of issues. The crisis of contamination, that is pollution, and the crisis of supply, that is the raw water resource itself. In many places, of course, these two sets of crises overlap. I'm not going to depress you with too many issues, but here's a quick sketch of some of the problems facing the water world. On the pollution issue, virtually none of the world's major rivers are any longer fit to drink in their wild state without treatment. Here's a piquant one. Suntan oil from too many millions of bathers along the south of France is now a serious pollutant in the Mediterranean and is one of the toxins killing off the sea urchins. There's just too many people slathering too much stuff on too many bodies. Somewhere in the world, a child still dies every 6 to 8 seconds from drinking contaminated water. This adds up to about 5 million a year. A decade ago, Peter Glick of the Pacific Institute suggested that if water and sanitation services across the world didn't improve radically, as many as 135 million people a year would die from water-related diseases over the next 20 years. About the same number as those killed in all the wars of all of human history. That prediction sounded extravagant, but it actually came true. That many people did die of waterborne diseases a decade ahead of Dick's schedule, and so on and so on. On the supply issue, to take just one example, in China, satellite pictures show hundreds of lakes and rivers disappearing, going dry, as aquifers diminish and springs cease to flow. In the 1950s, the country, China, had 50,000 rivers. True enough, many of them were small, with catchment areas not more than 100 square kilometers. But even so, by 2010, the number was down to 23,000 rivers. China had lost 27,000 rivers entirely. Water tables are dropping everywhere in Bangladesh, the Middle East, Western America, China. On the North China plains, water tables are dropping at better than a meter a year. And yet, when I was there 5 years ago in Xinzhuang, a small by Chinese standards, a small to medium-sized city of 2 million inhabitants, developers were advertising waterfront property. This is on the fringe of the Gobi Desert, by the way. Advertising waterfront property on lakes filled with pumped groundwater. It's insane. Nevertheless, with all these problems examined, they're solvable. All of them are solvable. It's not to say they will be solved, but they can be solved, and some of them are being solved. In each case, the real question is the degree to which these problems are a factor of natural constraints, that is, the actual water, and in which case the limits are real and fixed only with substantial effort. And yet, and on the other hand, how much is due to poor management and policy, in which case, of course, the remedy is obvious, if rather elusive, since good management, as we can plainly see from the state of the political world, is in hard premium in our times. A case in point, Pakistan, a country already an exceptionally dry place, has built only 2 large storage dams in the last 40 years, and those are already in trouble due to excessive silt through the same period. India, in the same period, built 4,000 dams, and China an astonishing 22,000 dams. Pakistan's dams store 30-day supply in drought conditions, India's 120-day supply. Even in Yemen, which, by the way, is likely to be the first country anywhere in the world to run out of water altogether, the problem is being caused mostly by profligate use, corruption, and mismanagement. So we need to approach solutions through both of the obvious paths, working in concert. The path of the engineer, that is, major infrastructure projects, bulk water transfers, dams, desalination, and so on, and the soft path, that is, don't increase the supply, reduce the demand instead. A couple of quick examples. About a decade ago, when I was filming in Namibia, the capital city of Namibia is called Windhoek. I was at a plant, and a water manager gave me a tumbler full of water and said, "Drink this. This is recycled sewage. So what are you going to do?" It would be churlish not to drink it, so I drank it. And of course, I knew how safe it was because Namibia had become the first major city anywhere on the planet to fully recycle all of its water, including sewage, into drinking water. It can be done. And a number of other jurisdictions have followed. Singapore now gets about 40% of its drinking water from recycled sewage. They rather delicately call it new water rather than recycled sewage, so as not to offend delicate sensibilities. But another example, desalination, which has always been criticized as a water hog, has become much more efficient now. Israel is now getting all of its drinking water from desalination techniques, And a group of scientists from the University of Manchester have developed a much less energy-intensive version of desalination using cheaply made graphene oxide as a sieve, therefore making desalinating the seawater both scalable and efficient. Two more quick examples before that I get the hook from our lady in front here. You may remember a year or so ago that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched what they called a Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. One result among many was a thing called the Blue Diversion device developed by Swiss scientists, a dry toilet that needs no piped water and no wired-in electricity. As the writer Sally Tisdall wrote in a piece for Harper's, it has been thoroughly tested by its end users. Her pun, by the way, not mine. A pilot project in Nairobi is currently using 27,000 people every day. China has commissioned the construction of 16 sponge cities to pilot solutions for freshwater scarcity and flooding developed in many cities as a result of urbanization and increasingly heavy rainfall. One more quick example. Ford engineers have now created a simple device that collects condensed water from automobile air conditioners and recycles it through a spigot into drinking water inside the car. And it was already well known that driving in hot conditions with your air conditioner on is already more environmentally positive than actually turning the air conditioning off and driving with the windows open. And my time is now up. It's a very quick sketch of what's going on in the water world, and we can talk more about it in a while, if you wish. Thank you.
Francesco Sandico is co-director of the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance and program leader of the Strathclyde LLM in Climate Change Law and Policy. Dr. Sandico's work focuses on international water law and policy with a special emphasis on transboundary aquifer law and policy, an area in which he's been collaborating with leading international organizations in Southern Africa, Central America, and South America. Francesco.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I would like to thank Kevin and the McKee Institute for inviting me here at this very, very interesting panel. What I would like to bring to the debate is a focus on groundwater within the context of global water security and an international law approach. It's important to look at all the water aspects and a multidisciplinary perspective. So the law is part of the puzzle, if you want. And because sometimes we talk too much and we don't arrive at a conclusion, let me give you immediately the two key messages of this brief talk. The first one is that if we look at water security at a global and transboundary level, we really need to fully take into account the potential of groundwater. It goes without saying, obviously, that we have to understand groundwater, but groundwater plays a very important role. And the second key message is that we often think that countries and territories like Canada here or Scotland where I work do not really have problems about water. It's everywhere, it's plentiful. We already have seen that that's not always the case. But I want to highlight that from an international law perspective, water-rich countries do have a role to play when it comes to global water security, both here and in countries that are under water stress. But let me start discussing a little bit more about groundwater. Now, our previous speaker, Mike, has highlighted, and well done on doing it in 10 minutes, all around the world, big problems. So these are figures that we usually see. 663 million people lack access to safe drinking water sources. Another really, really daunting figures, which, however, by the way, are somewhat better than just 10, 15 years ago. They're definitely not a good thing to see, but they are somewhat better. Now, a lot of these problems focus on the soft side, I would say. It's about governance a lot of times. But having said that, in many dry parts of the world, it's also about finding the water, about accessing water. Where do we find the water? And this is where groundwater becomes really, really important. Because what you have here is the amount of fresh water stored, surface water. So wetlands, large lakes, reservoirs, rivers. This is the available fresh water. Compare this with the amount of groundwater. Some figures put groundwater to up to 98% of available freshwater resources around the world. It goes without saying that if you're dealing with global water security, you better start understanding groundwater. And if you think that in terms of extractive industry, oil is the most extractive natural resource in the world, think twice. Groundwater surpasses oil 200 times around the world. So groundwater is a relevant issue. And if you start looking at groundwater beneath two countries, then things get even more complicated. There are, as of today, we identified 276 transboundary surface water basins. Since 1820, you have 400 agreements on the Nile, the Danube, the Mekong, you name them, lakes between Canada and the US. You also have, at the international law level, a treaty, a legally binding instrument within the UN family, the UN Watercourses Convention that was signed in 1997, entered into force in 2014, that sets the rights and obligations of countries when they share a river. Do we have a similar pattern when it comes to groundwater, when it comes to transboundary aquifers? Not really. We actually have many more transboundary aquifers. And the number is up and counting. We have 592 transboundary aquifers around the world, several of them between Canada and the US. But we only have, as 2017, 4 agreements in force. I'll show you which they are. Only 4. And 2 are waiting to enter into force. And not only that, but we don't have a treaty. We don't have hard, legally binding law. We have a set of, I'll call them, guiding principles adopted by the United Nations International Law Commission on the law of transboundary aquifers. Very dry regions of the world, such as Africa, have a lot of these aquifers. It's very important. Now, these are, on the slide, the 4 aquifers that are currently regulated. You have the Guarani aquifer system in Latin America, shared by Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, which I can expand on in the debate. I have worked quite a lot on that specific aquifer. In Northern Africa, you have the Nubian Sandstone aquifer system, which I'll mention in just a second, and the Northwestern Sahara aquifer system. In West Africa, you have the Euromedon. In the Middle East, you have the Al-Dizi, the Dizi aquifer between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. That's the most recent one with an actual in-force agreement. And in Europe, you have a very small aquifer, the Genovese aquifer between Switzerland and France. But let me focus only on one. This is the Nubian Sandstone aquifer system. It's a huge aquifer in one of the driest parts of the world. It's shared by Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan. A few characteristics are worth mentioning here. This is a fossil aquifer. What that means is that once you mine it, once you extract water from it, you don't have any more. It's not replenished. It's not recharged. And it goes without saying that any aquifer of these characteristics needs a specific, very cautionary management approach. Because once you've finished with it, there's no going back. This is governed in a way by law. There is some sort of an international agreement, but it's very minimal. The only thing it does is sets up an obligation to exchange information. Much more detailed rules about pollution, about management practices, about sharing the water. That's not present there yet. So not only do we have only 4 agreements around the world, but 2 of them, this and the Northwestern Sahara Aquifer system, are very, very rudimentary. Not to say that they're not important, but they're really just the first element to proper management. So the point I want to make here is that water security at global level needs to fully take into account the potential of groundwater. You have to really get your head around groundwater. You have to go talk to a hydrogeologist. You have to have people that work with groundwater. And from my side, law becomes quite important, because any country that does have one of these transboundary aquifers that has the political will to start talking to its neighbor will want to have the emerging international law applicable to this specific natural resource in front of them to start a conversation. So it's very important to raise the awareness and to start a political conversation about transboundary aquifers. Now, you may think, well, this is all fine, but is this really relevant for water-rich countries like Canada and so forth? Or at least some parts of Canada? And I would say yes. And the first reason is because Canada, many countries of the European Union, all of us have subscribed to something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals apply to every single country, whether you're Malawi, whether you're Bolivia, whether you are Canada. In a way, it applies to all in the same way. And SDG 6, the water SDG, says that by 2030, we have to secure access to all. Every single person has to have access to safe drinking water. But it's not just rhetoric. It's not just, well, okay, you say it, but then who cares? No. Water-rich countries such as Canada have to start doing efforts, have to start putting things in practice. So, for example, what Lalita was saying, Canada will have to report back, will have to compile the efforts. And where does it bring these efforts? Actually, Canada, together with many other countries, has volunteered to start showcasing its efforts in 2018, next year in July, at the high-level political forum, which is, if you want, the monitoring place of the Sustainable Development Goals in New York next July. So we'll start seeing how Canada is actually performing. But there's a second reason why water-rich countries should be very attentive at this. And this is because of the link between the SDGs and the fact that as of today we can say that water is a human right. But then, what does that even mean? I can go in the streets and say, water is a human right, but the practical elements of it, what does it mean? Does it mean that a rich place like Canada in terms of water, or Scotland, has the obligation to send water to Yemen? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that some characteristics of the delivery of water have to be present. Water has to be available, has to be safe, and it has to be accessible. If you think that because you have a human right to water, you're entitled to free water, according to international law, that's not the case. But it has to be affordable. So even water-rich countries have to think about that. But the interesting point that the UN Special Rapporteur, Leo Heller, on the right to safe drinking water has highlighted in 2 reports in 2016 and 2017, is that countries like Canada have a further obligation, and this is towards water-stressed countries. And it's within its international development agenda. Donors like Canada, like Germany, like Finland, and so forth, implement a lot of projects, be it in Peru, in Southern Africa, and so forth. In those projects, they have to consider the human right to water. And what that means in practical terms are elements such as do not put conditionality in those terms of the contract, in the terms of the lending, in the terms of the projects. And try as much as you can to bring sustainability to the issue and bring ownership to those countries that are water stressed. So with that, I finished, and I look very much forward to questions in the debate.
Super, thanks so much. So we'll shift now and start taking some questions from the floor. And as is the normal practice, we're going to start with questions from students from the policy class. As soon as I can get to my list, oh, here it is. Reese Robinson is up first.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. This panel's been very interesting. So my name is Reese Robinson. I am an MA candidate in the political science program here. My question's for Dr. Syndico. So I got the impression from your readings, as well as what you were saying today, that there's definitely an issue with a lack of awareness around transboundary aquifers, especially with regard to UN member states. So sort of wondering, getting your opinion on how we can kind of increase state engagement with reference to the UN draft articles, and sort of how you think, what you think the best way going forward would be to address these, whether we should keep pushing for a binding resolution, or if we should just keep them as guidelines and sort of allow countries to create their own agreements where they share transboundary aquifers.
Shall I reply immediately?
Yes, please.
So thank you very much for the question. I think there are two parts of it. How do we raise awareness, and what can be the future format, even from a technical perspective, from a legal nature of these guidelines, as I have called it? In relation to the awareness, I really think it's linked to two other aspects which are not related to groundwater. And I'll clarify. If you go to a country, be it in an international project or be it in the civil society advocacy, and you start bombarding them on the importance of groundwater, on global water security, in many of these countries, even the water-stressed countries, they will not immediately make the link, and they will focus on other priorities. It could be eradication of poverty, it could be corruption. So you have to be a bit strategic. And one way I have seen that has been quite powerful is to link groundwater to, say, for example, climate change adaptation or to sustainable development. Because if you have in the room a set of policymakers and you start highlighting issues that they are interested in, then they will start listening to you. So I'm sure there are other strategies, there are other ways, but from a practical perspective, you have in the room, you want to make that room attentive. You want to say something that will wake them up, you know? And if you don't have too powerful coffee, you need to do something else. The second question is about what is the future of the law of transboundary aquifers? And I hope you don't mind if you just give me 30 seconds to just put this into perspective. Because for non-lawyers, there's this assumption that, well, a treaty will always be the best thing. It's like in domestic law. You need a contract because it's enforceable, and if something goes wrong, you send somebody to prison and so forth. Take that mentality and throw it out the window when it comes to international law. It's very, very different. When the draft articles were negotiated, let's call them like that, some countries did want it to become a treaty. But fast forward 10 years, now in 2017, I truly think there will be very, very few countries around the world who are engaged in this, for some of us, extremely important aspect of international relations. But if you look at the global picture, this is very small within international relations. Most of them will not look for a future treaty and are in a way happy with what they are now, soft and non-legally binding. And you know why? Because what Mike was saying, solutions are local. And this is very powerful, and I have seen it also in practice. If you wait for, and I'm thinking, for example, of US and Mexico, if you wait Mexico City and Washington, D.C. to come up with a solution for a transboundary aquifer on the border between US and Mexico, you'll have to wait for a long time. But if you have the municipalities on both sides of the border, go on and deal with it. Using, because we have them, also, but not only, the draft articles as guidance. That is a powerful way forward. And you have examples in Canada with the transboundary aquifer shared by British Columbia and the state of Washington. There is management there. It did not have to wait an international treaty. It's done in an informal arrangement, if you want. So as much as I am all in favor of the draft articles, I'm all in favor of having these global guidelines, the practical reality is that a lot of times, once you have political will, especially at subnational level between municipalities, you can just steer ahead.
Thank you. Jamie Zhang.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie, and firstly, I want to thank all the panelists for their memorable presentations. My question is directed to Dr. Burns. So I want to go back to your study on risk perception. So taking into account people's perspectives, to what extent do you think people's individual perceptions, biases, cultural backgrounds influence their responses on the survey?
Thank you. Yeah, people perceive risks differently, and sociodemographic variables will affect people's risk perceptions. I mean, that's relates a lot to what Lolita was speaking about. One thing we did measure in our study was we looked at cultural theory, or Mary Douglas's idea of cultural theory, looking at hierarchists, people who believe that things are best managed through rules and procedures. Egalitarians who think that cooperation is the best way, and knowledge sharing. Individualists who believe that water is a commodity, and so we looked at some of these different cultural typologies, because we didn't collect data on we didn't collect, we collected data about male, female, and a bit on age, but we didn't look at any kind of other demographic variables. But basically what we found was that people who were senior managers tended to be more hierarchical, as you might expect, than the rest of the workforce. But the majority of responses were egalitarian, which suggested that they were open to sharing knowledge and best practice in terms of, well, when perhaps dealing with an uncertain risk like a cyber attack, an egalitarian would perhaps be willing to either call up a colleague at a different water utility and share that information. How does that play out in terms of risk perceptions? We didn't find any differences in terms of how we measured risk between those groups. Why not? Well, probably because the people who who took part in our study, they were operators or managers, and I wouldn't go so far to call them all experts, but they were much more informed about, you would ask me, I'm a lay member, how is flooding going to impact water security? I don't know. But experts or more informed people tend to think about risk in terms of this probability times consequence framework as compared to lay people. And that's one of the reasons why when we measured risk perception, I wanted to measure likelihood times probability. A next step in our research might be to broaden perceptions of risk perceptions of risk and security with respect to water to the general public, because that has implications for risk, for not only for risk management, but also risk communication. And I think Lolita gave a good example of how perceptions with respect to risk do vary according to groups. Just kind of maybe an informal example. I was at a risk perception conference at Harvard a few years ago, and there was a chap who was doing a talk about water in Latin American or Hispanic people in the southern United States. And he was talking about how these people spent a disproportionate amount of their income on bottled water, when the United States is a fairly safe, I drink tap water. But coming from Latin and South American countries, these people didn't trust the local water supply. And so even when they were in the United States, they still chose to buy bottled water, which in many cases was just the local tap water, maybe a little bit filtered. But the, I guess the short answer to your question is people, culture does matter with respect to risk perception and behavior.
Thank you. I'm compelled to say I think Calvin would have done very well in the midterm last week because they had a question on cultural theory, Calvin, and you would have knocked it out of the park. I want to just expand a little bit on what Calvin said as the co-author of the report. So this is one, I think, a very useful way to use this sort of theory, right? To think about what is the organizational culture, and through Calvin's work we determined it largely to be consistent with an egalitarian culture. And so what's interesting about that is when you're dealing with low probability, high consequence events, there's an absence of data, right? And Calvin has pointed this out. There's just, we don't have big bang disasters all the time. Thank goodness, right? If we did have them all the time, we'd have more data, we could manage it down, and it'd be more effective. But we don't. So if you're working in a sector that's open to sharing more information, then the answer might be to create an infrastructure that allows more information sharing to occur so that you can increase the data pool. So Canada is a kind of difficult country to govern because it's a small population spread across this massive border. But if you could create a capacity to share information among water suppliers across that border, you could increase the data pool and and you could share experiences and you could learn a little bit more about how to manage the risk. I mean, one of the things that was very interesting about the interview, so I did the interview side of the research, was how often the water operators said, we usually ended off with a question like, what would you like to get out of this report? What do you want to see come out of it? And they're a nosy bunch, I have to say, the water service providers, because they all said, I want to know what everybody else says, right? Like they wanted to know. But there's an openness to sharing information in the water sector. Not all critical infrastructure sectors are like that. There are some that are highly, highly competitive, and they will not share information at a minimum unless there's a lot of non-disclosure agreements that are signed and a whole legal process that goes on. But generally, most critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, and it's quite difficult to get those sectors to share information. The water sector is quite unique in this sense. They're more likely to share information, when it's publicly owned and in a non-competitive context. Generally speaking, there might be I'm sure there's some exceptions, but when you compare it to some other critical sectors, they're much more, likely to share information than some others. So anyway, that could be a possible outcome from the research, is to sort of suggest building an infrastructure for sharing more information. Michael Nagara is up next. Michael.
My name is Michael. I'm an MPA candidate. My question goes to Dr. Lalita. You mentioned that First Nation communities face a greater risk in relation to water. So my question is, what kind of strategies have they adopted at the local level to supplement otherwise ineffective or unavailable services from government?
Okay. Thank you for your question. Well, as Calvin was mentioning, trust in your water system is really key when you perceive your water safe to drink. So what communities have done, at least in Saskatchewan, is they've adopted a new treatment system called an integrative biological reverse osmosis system. And they seem to be very, very keen in the system, and they trust it. And the reason is because it aligns with their cultural meaning of water. And because it's a biological system, it does not require a lot of chemical additives to the water to create safe drinking water. So some of the strategies that have been applied would be the implementation of these integrative biological reverse osmosis systems. Other strategies that some communities have done is create arrangements with neighboring municipalities to bring water supply into the community. These have their pros and cons. One community in northern Saskatchewan has a municipal treatment agreement with a neighboring municipality. However, when there was a contamination event, the communication around that contamination event was well communicated within the municipality, but it did not reach to the community level 2 weeks after the contamination event. So that there is a lot of issues in terms of risk communication around water supply and safe drinking supply. So I think those two are some relevant and real applied examples, at least from Saskatchewan.
Okay, we'll open up to the floor now if anybody has other questions for our panelists. We'll go to the back.
Thank you. My name is Cecilia. I'm an MPA candidate. My question is for Dr. Burns. Lolita may also be able to address it. Dr. Burns, you mentioned that infrastructure is one of the highest perceived risks. I would say it's not only perceived, it's very real if Flint, Michigan is anything to go by. Would you say privatization would be an adequate or accurate response, particularly since Lolita had mentioned that employing and retaining technical expertise is proving to be difficult for government?
So could you say the question again? Would privatization be
an adequate or accurate response, considering Lolita had mentioned that employing and retaining technical expertise is proving to be a problem for government?
I'll be speaking outside of my experience base, but I will give an answer. The short answer is I don't know. That's about the most honest I can be. I mean, I could see reasons for. I could see reasons for both. Usually, when industries get privatized, there is a loss of expertise. I'm thinking in particular of the UK railways in the mid-1990s, when the British Rail used to be the industry, and after the railway industry in the UK was privatized and broken up, there was a lot of expertise that left the sector because people retired or they found jobs in other sectors, and oftentimes it would have been people were railwaymen for 2 and 3 generations. On the other hand, organizations, HR professionals know the importance of retaining, trying to retain expertise, and they try to capture it in other ways. For example, policies and procedures. It's kind of write down everything you know about how to deal with this problem. The downside to that is sometimes people think, well, I'm not going to tell you, the organization, everything I know, because, well, then you don't need me anymore, and I'm going to talk myself out of a job. So, okay, I guess if I had to come down on it, I guess you could say there probably is there probably is more evidence to suggest that privatization is associated with a loss of technical expertise than not. But that's not to say that through better people management and knowledge management practices, that organizations couldn't find ways to adapt to retain talent, and that's a big question. That's a big question in the general human resource management literature. And indeed, in our project, what we found was that many remote communities were, and this was coming out of the interview data, were saying that people came, went out to the middle of nowhere to a small community, worked for 2 or 3 years because they wanted to go back to the big city. So they found a job where they could get one. They gained a little bit of experience, and once they had that experience, they left. So smaller water utilities were finding it hard to retain expertise. And
can I pick up on that,
Yeah,
Calvin?
please do, yeah.
I think I wondered if, first of all, Lita made reference to this, the ability to retain talent, right, in the organization. Certainly came up in the interviews that we had that smaller towns, remote communities, it was very hard. And if you didn't have codified risk management practices, it was really being shared informally. And if people didn't stay, then they didn't really know. They didn't know how they handled the last disaster because there was really no sort of formal training. And so that seemed to be one issue around, codified risk management. I think it was interesting. I wondered, though, Calvin, if one of the kind of ways to come as a psychologist is to sort of say, almost to go as a kind of cultural theory way and say, well, what you would find is some people would be so highly distrustful of privatization that it wouldn't matter whether it made a difference or not. Some people would be for it and some people would be against it. And whatever went wrong, they would blame the privatization and whatever. I mean, would that be one way to kind of think about it?
if you're looking at it from the general public point of view or from the employee, well, either.
I mean, if we thought that the water sector was largely egalitarian, they'd probably be highly distrustful of privatization, is what I think.
Yeah, I think they probably would.
There might be other panelists with views on this. Mark, I think you've written about this, so maybe.
Yeah, I wrote quite a bit about privatization across the world. And really it happens mostly for two reasons. The first is that politicians are too craven to raise enough taxes to fix the problem. And so they want to pass it on to a private corporation and then pretend everything is going to be fine. And the other reason is privatization happens in places like, for example, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where the actual expertise and capital was completely missing, and this is the only way to actually fix or extend or bring about a coherent system. In both of these cases, you have pluses and minuses. Dar es Salaam is a good example of where the privatization was a complete disaster. On the other hand, there are half a dozen equally good examples where privatization was very successful. The kind of poster child for privatization was a place called Cochabamba in Bolivia, which was regarded as a huge triumph for the anti-privatization forces. They had they brought in a large conglomerate, Bechtel from America, which was supposed to fix and extend and bring water to the entire population of the town, and instead it was a complete disaster. They didn't achieve anywhere close to their goal. Prices went up very substantially, and the country is essentially, I think, fled is not too great a strong word, left Cochabamba, and it was really a huge triumph. The problem with it after the fact, because I went back there 10 years later, is that the system is now worse than it was before, because the municipality, which was already corrupt to start off with, and assigned this privatization contract because it was unable to do anything about it itself, reverted to the kind of people's community, and they remained incompetent and they remained corrupt. And so now, as a consequence of privatization, so this was a bad example of privatization, as it was in Dar es Salaam. But having looked at maybe half a dozen or a dozen of these things, privatization is essentially neutral, because it can be good privatization and it can be bad privatization. The one in Hamilton, Ontario is probably a best known Canadian example where Philips was assigned through a contract was written with to provide private expertise to the water delivery system, but the contract was written so that if anything went wrong, the municipality picked up the tab. So it was an absurd contract to write in the first place, and indeed there was a sewage overflow, and the municipality picked up a huge amount to clean up the harbor. So, but with proper contractual oversight and with careful targets written into the contract, privatization has been proven to work quite well in many places of the world.
Can we get another question from the floor? Yep, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, the panel. My observation, and of course a comment, would probably attract a reaction from Francesco, either Francesco or Lalita. I've seen contradictions here. For example, if we say that Canada is part of the water-rich countries, for example, in the world, and then we have the extreme end, that is, you have a presentation that highlighted coliform like infections, water contamination happening in some of the indigenous communities in Canada. And we've seen how whatever treatment strategy that is working for those communities, and still Canada is considered as one of the water-rich countries. In 2015, in June, at Memorial University in Newfoundland, St. John's, I came to attend a conference entitled Water Justice. And I met with a chief from one of the indigenous communities in Newfoundland, and he highlighted the concern of indigenous people. Obviously, in the presentation, we've realized that people have water cultures, like people's cultures attach them so much to water. They have some spiritual life in water, and that is exactly what the chief mentioned. But in a nutshell, what I learned from that is that even in those communities, they are to some extent detached from the use of water and the benefits they derive from the water. For example, the license were issued to big-time fishing trawling companies that would come and fish. And then these communities would depend on the same water, the same fish, to survive. And they have less power to counter whatever powers or influence the companies, because they've already paid for the license. So these are the issues that are happening right. So for me, I see Canada struggling to still ensure water justice issues are addressed for the indigenous communities.
So let's take that point about the irreconcilable differences or the tensions in Canada. If we can just take it from there and get some comments from the panel. Thank you.
Did
Reconciling,
you want to speak
squaring
on
the
the law
circle here.
aspects, or?
I'll pick up from where you finish.
Okay. So, when we think about First Nations in Canada, or Indigenous communities in Canada, we need to understand that First Nations are nations within our nation. So they're separate nations. So we have over 600 First Nations communities, and they have jurisdiction over their land based on what was given to them for those who have signed treaties. Okay, and I'll speak to my experience and the lessons I've learned from the Indigenous communities within Saskatchewan with whom I work. So one of the issues is, for example, water source protection. Now, communities can develop their water source protection plans. However, they only apply to the reserve boundary. So it speaks to some of the transboundary issues at a local level, that if their water supply crosses that boundary between the reserve and other lands outside that, that are provincial lands, for example, they have no control or power or decision-making capacity outside their boundary. So it creates issues for contamination. And there are many communities, at least in Saskatchewan, who've experienced contamination from agricultural activity, and I'm not pointing any fingers at anybody, in relation to the building of dams and the flows of that water resulting in flooding that accentuate water contamination issues for drinking water. So yes, there are issues in terms of governance and regulation.
I'll keep it very brief, as I saw another question popping up. Obviously, I don't know about Canada, so I'll give you a more international law perspective. There is an international law applicable to the rights of Indigenous people. And you could say, so what? What does it say? Is it really useful? The way I see it, it's about power decision making. So let's assume that you are in a part of your country and investment is coming in, be it building of a dam or a mining operation. What in practical terms the rights of Indigenous people from a human rights perspective means is that you as an Indigenous community cannot just be bulldozed and just your water is captured by this investment company. There has to be public participation, and more importantly, if you are not consulted, if you're not part of that decision making, there has to be a source of access to justice, water justice hence, for you. All this is all nice on paper. Whether it actually happens, it then becomes a domestic governance issue. If you're in a part of the world where you're an Indigenous community and your local country does not allow you for access to justice, or you're not happy with it, and you can go to an international Court of Human Rights, be it the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the African Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, then you have a further opportunity. But there's procedural elements of public participation, access to justice, which would really be the practical elements of water justice.
We have time for one last question.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura McPherson. I'm an MPA student here at Dalhousie. Thank you for being here. So Marc, you had talked about some of the challenges and the solutions taking place at the local level. And in Atlantic Canada, and more specifically where I'm from, in Prince Edward Island, it's the smallest province in Canada. One of the issues around water has to do with the agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector is putting pressure on the provincial government to remove a moratorium on deep water wells so that they can irrigate their land. A lot of the farms in that region are growing, and as an insurance factor, farmers want to have the opportunity to irrigate so that they can make sure that their yields increase. But there's big pushback from environmentalists. There's a lot of fear around the supply of water. Actually, I don't even know what all the details are around the fear. I'm just wondering, my question is for anyone who'd like to comment, what are your thoughts on irrigation? Is it a bad thing? And what would your advice be to a government that's faced with this challenge?
Okay, I'll start with that one. Irrigation is a two-edged sword, for sure. Over-irrigation causes salination of the soil in the long term. It has deleterious effects on soil health up and down the hydrological cycle. And on the other hand, there are areas of the world, such as, for example, California, where crops that as we've come to know them, are not producible without substantial irrigation. Part of the solution, I think, is again in the governance, where I said earlier these problems can be solved. Whether they will be solved is a question of policy and will. In California, during the most recent drought, for example, I think about 7 or 8 million acre-feet of water was a shortfall. They were overdrafting their system by that amount, but fairly draconian restrictions on massive irrigation and on stormwater capture meant that of that, I think I don't know the exact number, but say we're 10 million acre-feet was a shortfall. By these conservation measures, they actually found 12 million acre-feet that they didn't have before. By fixing infrastructure, by fixing irrigation systems. And I have 2 examples from farmers in the Central Valley in California. That one was a walnut farmer, and they were simply used to, before the drought, they simply opened the sluices and let the water run through their orchards, and they had not even any meters on the water. They were just allowed to use as much as they wanted, and they paid virtually nothing for it. Subsequently, I have a friend who is a very high-end Pinot Noir grape grower thing, and he is incredibly parsimonious. He has drip irrigation. Each vine has a single emitter, and the water is incredibly closely managed. And that kind of technological solution, combined with the policy solutions, can in fact bring about very substantial changes in water use, and will eliminate a lot of the deleterious effects of mass flooding irrigation. Okay, so it can be done. It's expensive, and it's usually done under duress, in the face of a drought, for example, again to some public opposition. But in California's case, for example, it was overcome fairly comfortably. And in Australia is another example where they had the so-called millennium drought, which lasted from 2009 to 2012. And the single, as you know, the single largest river basin in Australia is the Murray-Darling Basin. Water supply in the Murray-Darling Basin dropped to 55% of the norm. And yet agricultural use, by very careful conservation measures and by open-ended water trading, privatization of water and water trading, they were able to bring back agriculture to within a hair of where it was before once the drought was over. So these things can be managed, but it does take a certain concerted political will to bring them off.
I think we're going to have to pause there because we've run over, but if there are further points on this, we can pick it up at the round table afterwards. It occurs to me that we have a psychologist, a toxicologist, a journalist, and a lawyer, or someone working in the legal field, international law, trying to resolve or highlight some of the issues in water for us, and I think that says something about the complexity, and I'm sure we could have another half dozen professions up here talking about different aspects of water and water policy. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that some of these people traveled a really far distance to come to talk to us today about water policy, and I really appreciate it, and I'm sure you do too. I'll present them gifts at the McKechnie Institute when we have the roundtable, but please join me in thanking everybody for coming to share their views. So we'll start again at 1:45 for the class, 1:45.